Hi everyone, welcome back. In this video, we will understand the React plus Spring Boot architecture in a simple and beginner-friendly way. This architecture is very common in real-world full-stack web applications. React is used for the front end, Spring Boot is used for the back end, and a database like MySQL or PostgreSQL is used to store the data. The main idea is simple. React handles what the user sees and interacts with. Spring Boot handles business logic, APIs, and backend processing. The database stores the actual application data. Now let's understand the complete request and response flow. The flow starts with the user or browser. A user opens the web application in a browser and interacts with the React frontend. For example, the user may open a product page, submit a login form, add an item to cart, or click a button to view data. React is responsible for building the user interface. It contains UI components, services, routing, forms, buttons, tables, pages, and client-side logic. So when the user clicks something or submits a form, React decides what should happen on the screen. But React usually does not directly talk to the database. Instead, React talks to the backend through REST APIs. This is where the HTTP client comes in. The HTTP client in React is used to send HTTP requests to the Spring Boot backend. For example, React may send a GET request to fetch data. It may send a POST request to create new data. It may send a PUT request to update data, and it may send a delete request to remove data. The data between React and Spring Boot is usually exchanged in JSON format. JSON is lightweight, easy to read, and commonly used in web APIs. So the front end sends a REST API request with JSON data, and the backend sends back a JSON response. Now the request reaches the Spring Boot backend. Inside the Spring Boot backend, the first important layer is the controller. The controller receives the HTTP request from React. For example, if React calls an API to get all products, the controller method handles that request. The controller does not usually contain heavy business logic. Its main job is to accept the request, call the right service method, and return the response. After the controller, the request goes to the service layer. The service layer contains the business logic of the application. For example, calculating order total, checking stock availability, validating user rules, applying discounts, or processing payment-related logic. The service layer is very important because it keeps business rules organized in one place. After the service layer, the request goes to the repository layer. The repository layer is responsible for data access. It communicates with the database using technologies like Spring Data JPE. For example, if the service wants to fetch products, save a user, update an order, or delete a record, it calls the repository. The repository then performs the required database operation. Now the request reaches the database. The database can be MySQL, PostgreSQL, or another database. It stores application data such as users, products, orders, payments, and other records. Once the database operation is complete, the data flows back to the Spring Boot backend. The repository returns data to the service layer. The service layer applies any required business logic and returns the result to the controller. The controller prepares the HTTP response and sends it back to the React frontend as JSON. Now React receives the JSON response. React updates the UI based on that response. For example, it may display a list of products, show a success message, update a table, navigate to another page, or show an error message. So the full flow is simple. User interacts with the browser. React handles the front end, UI. React sends a REST API request using JSON. Spring Boot receives the request in the controller. The controller calls the service layer. The service layer applies business logic. The repository layer talks to the database. The database returns data. Spring Boot sends a JSON response back. And React updates the user interface. This separation is one of the biggest advantages of this architecture. React focuses only on the front-end experience. Spring Boot focuses on back-end logic and APIs. The database focuses on storing and retrieving data. This makes the application easier to develop, test, maintain, and scale. For example, front-end developers can work on React screens, while back-end developers work on Spring Boot APIs. Both parts communicate using REST API contracts. If the UI needs to change, we can update React. If business logic needs to change, we can update Spring Boot. If data structure needs to change, we update the database and backend accordingly. So remember the quick rule. React is the front end. Spring Boot is the backend. REST API and JSON connect them together. And the database stores the actual data. That is React plus Spring Boot architecture explained in a simple way.